traditional media, as Professor Picard had mentioned earlier, they're dependent upon each other right now. Very dependent, because online right now gets its news from the traditional newsroom. Yeah, we are integrating to a degree, but basically the reason why all those reporters that are out there exist is, again, because of the print side, or the TV side, if you're in TV, and the radio side. There are very few newspapers or radio stations or TV stations that are doing original reporting or have their own reporters for the online side. More and more it's happening, but there aren't that many out there. The other part is most of the revenue, frankly, is coming as a result of having a traditional side. It's different at a large paper like the Wall Street Journal or the New York Times or USA Today, a national paper, but 73% of most U.S. newspapers' website revenues come from upsells to print. Somebody calls up the print side, says, hey, I want to take out a classified ad in print. Oh, would you like to also put that online for an extra $1? Sure. Or maybe they don't even ask about an extra $1. They just put it online, and then their accounting provides a portion of that to the online operation. So there's very few of these operations, newspaper websites, TV station websites, whatever you want to call it, from legacy media, that you can actually place an ad just on the online side. You generally have to go through, at least in the classified side, the traditional part. And there's very few, with the exception of the major newspapers, national newspapers, who have their own sales staff for online. You know, out of 1,500 newspapers, there's probably 100 that have their own sales staff just for online. So again, the revenue is dependent upon having the traditional side. And as I mentioned, you know, unfortunately, there's this huge difference between the revenue value of a print user and an online user. So as the industry, the print industry gets a little more mature, do you want to have your online side of the business start to be hooked up to the older guy? Actually, in the case of the Bunker brothers, they were both healthy one night, and Eng, who I believe is the one on the right, woke up the next morning to find Cheng was dead. And that didn't make him too happy, because if one Siamese twin dies, well, you can imagine how long the other one survives. It actually was about 12 hours before Eng died. And if we are so dependent upon the traditional media side, and the revenue difference between print and online is so great, we've really got to do something, because when we hit that abattoir point that Professor Picard mentioned, we could go down with it. That's not a very cheery message, I'm sorry. This is a picture of the circulation revenue of U.S. weekday newspapers, slightly longer term than the one Gary mentioned here, peaked actually circulation in '85 and has been going down ever since. And actually this looks not that bad, because it's 54 million to 62 million, but bear in mind that during this time the U.S. population went up by 50%, and the number of college-educated Americans actually doubled. So this number should have gone up to like 80 million just to keep pace with population growth, and then the less education, but it's gone down instead. And you've seen some of the circulation figures from major newspapers going down in 5, 6, 7% or more over the last year or two. So can we increase the revenue fast enough to get to the point where we can take over on the online side and support quality journalism and even support the print side if necessary? Well, I mentioned the local is increasing greatly, but that's finite to a degree. And sooner or later, it's going to reach a rough equilibrium. And more national advertisers are getting involved. So this is going to swell the whole thing, and we believe the rates will go up. But we don't believe it's going to grow at 20 to 30 to 40% for more than a few years. 5 years? 6 years? I mean, it's illogical to think otherwise. So you've got this number here about the internet, that great slope line, but bear in mind that's not necessarily all newspaper, TV, radio companies that do journalism. A good degree of that upslope that we looked at, I'll get the next slide here, has to do with the pure play companies, the Googles and Yahoos, because their revenues are skyrocketing. A lot of newspapers are being very surprised to find that Google is now starting to get more and more local advertising, local growth. You know, so that as that local part of the pie increases, a lot of it's not going to journalism or companies that support journalism. A lot of it's going to the Googles and Yahoos, which is a very dangerous thing for journalism. So how can online be independent? I could go on for hours on suggestions on that, but let me give you 2 suggestions just to throw out. One practical, which can be done fairly easily by most media companies. The other one, which is going to be kind of longer or medium term, which will be wrenching, but I think is also a part of the equation here. One of the problems we've noticed is that 80% of U.S. newspaper website revenue is coming from the three traditional classified advertising categories. I mean, talk about thinking within the box. You know, this is roughly the proportion. 43% of the revenue is coming from job classifieds or display classifieds online. Property, real estate, 12%. Autos, 15%. The problem with that, whoops, wrong button, is that if you look at the amount of advertising spending online in local markets, it's only 10% of what advertisers are spending in markets like Austin. The rest of it, the 90%, is for other types of things. It could be, you know, putting an ad on MySpace. It could be putting things on a city directory. It could be, you know, other types of things that aren't traditional newspaper categories. So to a large degree, the newspaper industry has fallen into, I think that, you know, Clayton Christensen at Harvard calls it a disruptive technology trap, where, you know, they focus on the old stuff and are oblivious to the bigger picture that's opened up and created opportunities for them. Or I think it's another one at London School of Economics, Donald Sull, who talks about active inertia, that the companies continue to do what they've always done, forgetting that maybe they want to go in another direction. So companies, and this is not an ad conference, I know, but if it was an ad conference, I'd be begging the people there from newspaper and TV companies to look outside of the traditional stuff and expand the market, because there's a lot of money out there. And this is the money that Google and Yahoo and others are going after. So practically, that's something that can be done at most media company websites now to help support the news. The other one is a little more conceptual and a little more out of the box, but right now you guys are supermarkets of news. The Statesman Review, I don't know, might publish, what's the story count, 40, 50 stories a day at most? But you've probably got maybe 75 to 100 stories maybe that your reporters are doing or have drafted or want to do. You've got maybe 1,000 realistically, if you eliminate write-throughs coming off AP data features. You've got the syndicates. You've got probably 3,000 stories a day coming into your newsroom right now, and you publish 50. So you're a supermarket of news. But the problem is you publish 50, which your editors pick on the basis of the greatest demographic interest, because your press can only print one edition at a time. And the result of this is you've got a product which is basically like a supermarket where you've got all this stuff, but instead you wind up giving every single reader exactly the same bag of groceries, exactly the same edition, exactly the same content, even though you've got a whole cornucopia of other things out there. Forgive me, I'm going to pick on the Times again only because I'm a subscriber and I love the paper. But I'm a soccer and Formula One racing fan, having spent a lot of time in Europe. I can't get those stories. I don't see them in the New York Times except maybe one story a month. Yet I'm the former Reuters executive who sold them the Soccer Wire, who sold them, you know, the European sports wires. I know they've got soccer stuff. They've got the Swiss Intercantonal League scores. They've got the Turkish third division, but I can't get that. I can find it on the website, thank God, but I've got to click down through about 20 levels to find it. So to me, this is a mismatch of content. The stories are out there that people want. It's just that they aren't getting necessarily to the right people because we're still using the industrial era model of doing the same edition for everybody. And yeah, part of that's important. You want to make sure people have some serendipitous stories. They get the urgency of the bulletins. But a lot of the stuff here is a mix match, because the press can only print one thing to each person, you know. And that doesn't work in this century where we're going into a mass customization era. Call it personalization, individualization. But we've got to find a better way of mixing content to match people's interests, because we all have some generic interest. Each of us cares about the weather or Iraq in this country or something of that sort. But all of you have very individual, specific interests. And each of you is a unique mix of those interests. And we've got to find a way in our businesses to take the stories, because they're out there, and find a way of matching things to each person's interests, as well as giving them the major stories that they need to know. And people probably, I'm guessing here, I don't have data to back it, might be willing to pay for such a service. Because the reason a lot of people went, 1 billion people now on the internet, they gravitated to the internet not necessarily to read traditional media. They already had that. They went in there to find the individual mix of stuff they're looking at. That's why they go to Google. That's why they go to Yahoo. So we've got to find a better way of matching content, delivering the content which is already out there to people's interests. Also, one of the problems is we tend to use our own brands. I don't subscribe to my local paper in Greenwich, Connecticut, because it's all Tribune and AP, and that's fine, but I'd like some other sources of content. We've also got to find a way of breaking down the walled garden approach to be able to give people, if they want the national news, international news from the Times, the local news from Austin, the financial news from the New York Times, to match this stuff. Find the infrastructure, put it together to be able to match a person's content. Otherwise, the Googles and Yahoos are going to do it. And that's going to be a wrenching change for our industry in the next little while, being able to find a way to do that, because it will happen. And it's also going to be an interesting change for journalism professors who have traditionally done the mass media approach of everybody gets the same thing, this type of change. So those are two things, is go after the 90% of local online ads that you're not focusing on right now. Most papers can do that. And the other one is we've got to find a better way of mixing and matching to get people to pay for the service and add revenue. Because there's a lot out there, and that, in the interest of time, we're all in.
But we want to take time to have some questions. There's been a lot of interesting things thrown out there in the last 2 hours. We know the audience is eroding, the traditional advertising base is eroding. Online advertising is growing, but unfortunately most of that money's not going to newspapers, and newspapers will need, 20 to 100 new users to make up for what they're not getting. So I guess the question still remains, how do you support quality journalism in this brave new world of the internet and online journalism? Dr. Picard, would you like to, particularly if you believe, one of the things about journalism and news is that, and you mentioned, I think, in your presentation, that people have never just bought the newspaper for news, but in journalism, this whole idea of it being the foundation of democracy and a public service and not just, infotainment.
Yeah, that certainly is a huge problem, because if we believe that in the future society needs a source of information that helps the democratic process, and if we believe that the newspaper has to be that role, we have to do something different than we're doing today. I'm a believer that, there's nothing sacred about newspapers. Newspapers took on this role a century and a half ago because there needed to be an intermediary